This jumpy 8-bit boy is more than often being used as an example of perfection. I'm going to show you 5 reasons why it feels so good playing the game still today. But in order to understand why the
jumpy boy feels so good,
I need to explain that the
same boy used to be bad.
This is Jumpy Boy's daddy, Mr. Miyamoto. At first, Daddy Miyamoto wanted to become a manga artist, but he changed his mind and found that toys were nice. So he started designing stuff for Nintendo instead. Due to black greasy liquid, Nintendo had a hard time in the 70s. This forced them to rethink their behavior and abandon toys in order to start focusing on video games already. 3 years after Daddy Miyamoto was hired, Nintendo developed an arcade game called Radar Scope. It sucked so hard, Nintendo financially went down to one heart. After spending their whole budget producing 2,000 arcade units no one wanted, they had to once again rethink their behavior. They decided converting the units into new games was probably a better idea than throwing them away. However, all the pro developers were busy, so they settled with a young designer soon to be Daddy Miyamoto. Choosing an artist as the director of a game was unconventional back then. The teams usually consisted of hardware programmers making a game and then afterwards involving a designer only to paint the box. This is probably why a lot of the early arcades looked and felt weird. Hardware programmers aren't really known for being artistically skilled. So I don't think it would be an overstatement saying that this pivoted the whole industry into the direction it is today. I mean, another artist who became a director is this guy. 1981, Daddy Miyamoto gave birth to Donkey Kong, which featured the first version of Mario as the hero. Well, he was actually called Jumpman back then, but whatever, it's the same mustache. This was a huge success in the 80s for a lot of reasons. The artist Miyamoto brought great visuals, an incredible storyline, high-quality cinematic cutscenes, and never-seen-before gameplay. Let me explain why this game is terrible. Humans generally appreciate being somewhat in control over their lives. The less control you have, the more unpleasant the experience. But what does it have to do with gaming? Let's talk about the limitations of the game. In Donkey Kong, you can only jump in 3 set directions: to the left, to the right, and up. You can only jump in a fixed height, the height of Tiny Mario himself. The edges of platforms are sharp. 1 pixel off and you miss the jump, plus falling kills you. And the sound design is making me wanna stay still forever. Is this really how we want the world to be? However, it was the starting point of Miyamoto's career, and everything can be perfect from the start, right? Except for the channel you're watching. Please subscribe. After creating a failed Antipeda flying simulator, another Donkey Kong game, and a Popeye arcade, Mr. Daddy-san made the first standalone Mario game in 1983, Mario Bros. The design of the player controller was less sucky. Holding down the left or right button on the D-pad made you gradually go into running, which affected the jump angle. Finally, you had some control over the jumping process. It was still a bit wonky though, since you couldn't easily affect the angle of a jump from standing still. You had to start running before jumping in order to get an angle at all. Another plus with the game was that you didn't die falling from an edge, thank God. 2 years after Mario Bros, Mr. Daddy-sama created what came to be the most classic 2D platformer of all time. This is also where he more or less perfected the skeleton for the 2D platformer player controller, which still to this day is being used as a staple in new games. With experience of directing 11 games and designing 4 more, he put all the feedback and skills into this game, Super Mario Bros. One very important thing they fixed was what's sometimes called the rigid body of this bad boy. By rigid body, I mean the thing that makes this chubby boy interact with the environment. Without it, Mario goes straight to Australia and enemies pass through him. With it, he stays grounded. Instead of making it end at the exact same spot as his teeny tiny feet, they made it a little bit bigger. This made it easier to land on the platforms by some pixels, removing the frustration of sharp edges as in earlier games. Or rather, that's how they could have done it today. They applied the same effect in their own way using the arbitrary coding language of the 6502 CPU. Another very important thing they fixed was the adjustable height of a jump. Depending on how long you press the jump button, the height varies. If you press it as fast as I can say like and comment, the jump becomes super low. If you press it longer than that, the jump becomes higher. Something else they added was the implementation of a jump buffer. When Mr. Chubby Boy leaps into the air, nothing visually happens when the jump button is being pressed. But underneath the surface, there's a timer starting every time the jump input is given. Let's say it's counting down from 1 second. If you press the jump button while Mr. Plumber Man is in the air, and he lands within a second of you giving the input, he will immediately jump again after landing, even though you technically pressed the jump button when he was in the air. This made jumping feel infinitely more responsive. Something they did in order to change the feel of the jump was the weight of Mario's tiny belly. Since Mario is basically just a 2D picture, it's very hard to simulate gravitation in a believable way. So in order to make us get it, they had to exaggerate, which they did by gradually adding gravity to the chubby boy when he starts to fall after a jump. Or another way of putting it, making Mario exponentially heavier in the second half of a jump. Without this effect, jumping feels way more floaty. Take Samus' jump for example. It fits her perfectly since she's already in outer space. The fifth thing they fixed was the flexibility to change length and angle of the jump in mid-air. This made it so much easier to land where you wanted to. If you accidentally jumped, you could probably correct your mistake before it was too late. This functionality is something that a lot of us take for granted, by all right. There's even a game based on the inaccessibility of adjusting your jump mid-air, which hurts playing. If you're playing a platformer and it's not utilizing all of these points, I promise you that you will notice it. Even if you can't pinpoint exactly what it is, it will irritate you in some way. What won't irritate you is my last video, where I talk about how I turned my girlfriend into a sleep-deprived gamer. Or maybe you're more interested in how Metroid came to be, which you can learn all about in this video. Subscribe, bye.